Back in 1700, the most popular preacher in London was George Whitefield. He was still at that point a part of the Church of England, and he had become very enthusiastic, charismatic. He was holding revivals, and people were flocking to him. Sometimes more than 10,000 people would come to hear him. And it became a little annoying for the staid Church of England and a little bit disruptive for the politicians in town. And they decided they ought to curb this whole thing just a little bit. They thought of how they might do that. They suggested that perhaps they could make a law limiting how many people could gather at one time. But then one of the politicians, Philip Chesterfield, said, "I have a better idea. I know how you can silence Whitefield right away. Just make him a bishop, and then he'll be so busy just keeping the wheels of the institution of the church going that you won't have to worry about him." Well, fortunately, he didn't become a bishop. He went on preaching, and he came here to America and was part of the great religious awakening in the Northeast. But is it true that if you're busy helping the institution continue, that you lose your spiritual power? Well, it seems to have been for the chief priests of Jesus' day. When we think about those who opposed Jesus, we usually think about the Pharisees, because in the Gospels there are a lot more debates between Jesus and the Pharisees than any other group. But while the Pharisees were debating with Jesus, the chief priests or Sadducees were plotting to kill Jesus. He recognized that when he predicted to his disciples that he would die. He said to them in Mark 8:31, "Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." And sure enough, we read in Matthew 26 that they were plotting against him. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. And you remember that when you go over to the Gospel of John, we hear that Caiaphas actually said, "It's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to die." And John recognizes that that was a prophetic statement. It truly was better for Jesus to die. But of course, Caiaphas didn't know that. For him, it was just a statement of political expediency. We need to get rid of this guy. And sure enough, when it comes to the arrest of Jesus, it is the chief priests that lead out. While Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived with him, and with him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Reading on in the chapter, we find that they tried to find false testimony against Jesus. Now, the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus so they might put him to death. And finally, we come to the point where they take him to Pilate to be killed. And we read in Matthew 27:1, "When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death." It seems that all the way through, it is the chief priests who lead the way against Jesus. Now, who are these chief priests, and why are they so concerned about getting rid of Jesus? Well, the priests were the ones who led out in the temple. There was only one temple, that was in Jerusalem. Now, there were many synagogues, and people worshiped on Sabbath in synagogues spread throughout Palestine and the whole Mediterranean world. The services there were like our worship services in many ways, but it was not priests who led out there. It was generally lay elders. But the temple in Jerusalem was the only place where there could be sacrifice. And it was the priests who had charge of the temple. They led out in the sacrifices. They led out in the festivals as the people came to celebrate Passover and the other great feasts. They were the ones who led out in the singing and the praising of God, the singing of songs. They believed that the temple was the place where God lived. And it was important to keep the temple going. Of course, Rome was ruling, so it wasn't always easy, and they developed the fine art of negotiating with Rome so that they could keep the institution going. But something happened along the way. They had done it so many times, and it carried through that it became a ritual, and where their worship was supposed to help them see the sacredness of all of life, instead they lost track of the sacredness even of the worship, and it was just another round of ritual. And in addition, they learned that they could benefit from what was happening in the temple. After all, people who came from long distances for the sacrifices of the great festivals couldn't bring their own animals, and they had to get an animal from someplace, and so they could sell them animals, and there was some profit in that. They also didn't want the Roman money with pictures of the emperor on it to pollute the temple, so they had the people change that money into temple money, and there was a profit in that. And they ended up doing rather well, thank you. If you're ever in Jerusalem, go over to the west of the temple area and go down underground and see the homes of the chief priests that they have excavated. This is a model of one of them. When you walk into these homes, they're luxury homes. There are mosaics on the floor. At the time of Jesus, these homes would have had wonderful views looking out over the temple area. They were doing rather well. And you know, when you're doing well, it's kind of hard to think of having the apple cart upset. You don't want to rock the boat. You want to maintain the status quo. And so they became so interested in maintaining the status quo and keeping the institution going and the wheels rolling that when the God that lived in the temple came face to face with them in Jesus Christ, they not only didn't recognize him, but they wanted to get rid of him because he was a threat to their institution, a threat to their way of life, a threat to their cash cow that the temple had become for them. So it is possible for people to lose sight of the spiritual while the institution just keeps the wheels rolling. But it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, institutions are very beneficial. I certainly want to give you the idea that institutions are bad in themselves. Institutions can be wonderful. They can have a mission, and they can be used to do great things. Let me give you one example from outside of the realm of the church. Last November, I was in San Diego for a convention, and I heard our former president, Jimmy Carter, speak. Carter has started the Carter Center, an institution to try to do good in the world. In 1986, that institution tackled a problem. In Africa, 3.5 million children were dying every year from guinea worm disease. The guinea worm is a tiny little worm. You can't even see it with the naked eye, but it infests drinking water. And when children would drink it, those worms would get into their system, and within the little time they grow to more than a foot long, and they start sapping all of the nourishment that the child gets, and the child dies. 3.5 million cases a year. And so in 1986, the Carter Center decided, let's start doing research to do something about it. Jimmy Carter went to one of his friends that he knew would usually come through with money, and he said, I need $50,000 to get us started on research to see what we can do about the guinea worm problem in Africa. The fellow said, okay, I'll give you $50,000, but I can do something better too. He said, I sit on the board of the largest chemical corporation in America, and at our next board meeting, I'm going to bring this up and see if we can help do something about it. He did, and they developed a filter that the water could go through, but it would filter out the guinea worms. Of course, that was just the beginning. Then they had to have thousands of people go out to all the villages in Africa and teach people to use this filter and not to let children drink water if it hadn't gone through this filter. 1986, 3.5 million cases a year. You know how many cases there were in Africa last year? 126. Almost all of them in the South Sudan. Over 80 million lives of children have been saved over the last almost 30 years because of what this institution has done. Institutions can be wonderful. They can do great things that we could never do all by ourselves. Seventh-day Adventism has flourished through our institutions, educational institutions, medical institutions. Think what the Azure Hills Church would be if all of a sudden Loma Linda University and Medical Center and Loma Linda Academy and La Sierra University and all the Adventist institutions in our area simply disappeared. This would be a very different church. In fact, how many of you work for some entity associated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Medical, educational, the church structure. May I see your hands? How many? Wow, it looks like pretty close to half of us. That's a good thing, because institutions can be wonderful and used by God, and the fact is Adventism does much better in reaching out to the world where we have institutions than where we don't. But even though institutions can do great good, they can also be dangerous, because it's possible for us to forget the mission of the institution and make the institution an end in itself. And so instead of recognizing that the institution is there for God to use us to bless others, we focus simply on the institution itself. We think about what a good life we have in the institution and forget the mission. Phil Jackson, the former coach of the LA Lakers, tells the story of Red Holzman, who coached the New York Knicks from 1967 to 1982. He said Red Holzman loved being an NBA basketball coach. He thought it was a great life. He said this, "How could it not be great? We stay in the finest hotels, travel first class, get this great per diem on the road." And then he threw his hands in the air and said, "But these games, they just keep coming, they never stop. If we could get rid of these games, it would be a great life." A basketball coach who says it's a great life if you just didn't have all these games you have to play. I heard of a pastor who was asked what his ideal church would look like. And he said it would have a great office with a big view and a huge library for him to study, and would have no members to bother him. I was in academia long enough to know that there are some professors who enjoy academic life so much. They love their research, but they think it would be a lot better if there just weren't these bothersome students around. It's possible for us to forget that the institution is to serve is a part of the way God helps us serve others and focus only on it being a great life for us. I worry that that can happen with our church structure, that we can build up a superstructure where we have more and more people, more and more layers of administration in the church, and fewer people actually doing ministry where it happens with people. And it can happen in the local church, whether we work for the church or whether we don't. The local church is here to serve. It's here to do God's work in the world. And it's possible for us to forget that. And instead of serving others, we simply keep this institution going because it's a nice family place for us to be. And just as the chief priests failed to see God in the face of Jesus, we can fail to see Jesus in the face of the poor and the hungry and the prisoners. Institutions are wonderful as long as we keep sight of our mission and never let the institution become an end in itself. It's always inspiring to see someone who has that sense of mission, who realizes that what they are doing is important, who takes it seriously and does their best because they have a sense of mission. They recognize that what they do makes a difference for people. I saw Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor of the San Francisco Symphony, give a TED talk not long ago. In this talk, he tells a story of going to a rest home to visit his cousin and having an experience that reminded him how much music can mean in the lives of people, and therefore how important it is for him to take every performance seriously and do his best because it matters. Now, he uses one expression that I wish he didn't, but if you can get past that, listen to the sense of mission that he portrays.
I was visiting a cousin of mine in an old age home, and I spied a very shaky old man making his way across the room on a walker. He came over to a piano that was there, and he balanced himself and began playing something like this. And he said something like, me, boy, symphony, Beethoven. And I suddenly got it, and I said, friend, by any chance, are you trying to play this? And he said, yes, I was a little boy. The symphony, Isaac Stern, the concerto, I heard it. And I thought, my God, how much must this music mean to this man that he would get himself out of his bed, across the room, to recover the memory of this music that after everything else in his life is sloughing away still means so much to him. Well, that's why I take every performance so seriously, why it matters to me so much. I never know who might be there, who might be absorbing it, and what will happen to it in their life.
He takes every performance seriously because he doesn't know who's going to be there, and it matters because it makes a difference in people's lives. We have been given the task of taking the music of the kingdom to our friends and neighbors. It matters. It makes a difference in people's lives. How can we do anything but keep that sense of mission and take it seriously? Because it can mean so much to people's lives, and maybe even eternity.